When you sent me some questions the other day, you seemed quite intrigued by sort of a science background. I had to clarify that a little bit, that I'm just a dumb engineer. Where's your hot spot right now? What are you thinking when you get on the phone call here?
One of the big things for me is that, and what led me to talk about science and you talk about engineering, is that for a long time, I've downplayed my background in science because I felt like it wasn't that related to leadership. And I felt like that's something I did a long time ago. It's kind of cool that I did it, but It's not relevant. I've shared that with a few people lately, and they're saying, on the contrary, you bring something in that's different than anybody else, and it's useful and simple. I feel a little funny because I thought talking with you would be a way to bring something out that people are finding valuable, that I feel like it's a blind spot for me.
It's interesting. So my career did start in the engineering world. I spent about a decade actually in heavy industrial construction engineering projects. One of my first jobs was walking structural steel several hundred feet in the air, which kind of relates to some other things that are happening with me and my clients right now. And then I shifted, after 10 years of that, I saw some of the very first microcomputers. So this was a little prior to the IBM PC. Microsoft was still in New Mexico. They hadn't even set up their Seattle office yet. And I was so intrigued by microcomputers and what they were going to do for us, I left the construction engineering business and started a software company at the very sort of dawn of the age, and spent another decade in software development. And then, I don't know, my wife calls it a midlife crisis, but, essentially asked that sort of classical question of what do you really want to do when you grow up? I'm still asking that question, but at the time, I thought, well, it's odd that you've had such, very technical careers that were very different. And one was literally pouring concrete and putting up steel and piping and big equipment, and the other was working in a world that you never saw. It was just in the background in software. And what I began to realize about myself was that every day I went to work, I was focused on being a better leader, growing better leaders, helping our teams function better. I began to realize that it didn't make too much difference to me what the product was, what the output was. I felt if I could build great teams and great leaders, the business would take care of itself. Then sort of face that same thing you were just talking about. How do I go out and talk to clients at the very top of organizations and say to them, I know how to pour concrete, let me be your leadership coach? To me, it seemed like I was totally inadequate, had the wrong education. But what I quickly found out is that no, my clients at the tops of all of these organizations loved that I had spent time in sort of the hard sciences in one form or another. And I thought more like them. It turned out to be quite an asset. One of the issues I seem to find myself working with all of my clients right now is just the stress of our business lives. People are just feeling overwhelmed. One of the better resources I found recently, a book called Performing Under Pressure. In that book, they try to distinguish between stress and pressure, where pressure, it has some very dire consequences to it. And if you don't succeed, bad things happen. And I tell stories of walking structural steel and being scared to death and having to pass someone on a beam that's 200 feet in the air and 40 feet long and 6 inches wide. If either one of us misstep, we're both dead. Very early in my career, I learned what real pressure was. Stress then doesn't bother me so much. Stress is just lack of resources to get something done. There's just not enough time, not enough money, not enough human capital, something. That's what creates stress. But you'll live through that. You may not live through pressure. Some of those early backgrounds have really paid off. I mean, my clients really seem to connect with the real world experience of engineering and computers and software. And
were these people that connected, were they themselves former scientists, former engineers, former laborers, or were they people who came through other routes? Like, were they connecting with something that was in their lives, or were they connecting with something that you brought in that wasn't new to them, that was new to them?
The group I was working with in Boston actually is a startup pharmaceutical company. Lots of stress, lots of things to do. They have to do things well. They have to, I don't know how much you know about the pharmaceutical business, but typically, pharmaceutical companies will spend upwards to $1 billion bringing a drug to market with no guarantee that it will ever actually reach the market. Literally at the end of that process is when they find out whether their drug is going to be in the marketplace or not. So huge stress in that industry, especially in a startup where you don't have big company resources behind you to buffer some of that. Very different backgrounds than mine, although scientific in this case. I don't know. It's beginning to share on those levels seems to help with so how do we lead this? How do we minimize the stress? How do we build our teams? How do we perform better in these situations?
It's easy for me to see why a science background or an engineering background would not help people deal with situations like this. What's less obvious to me is how it does help. What did you find it did help? Can you be more specific?
I guess I'll go back to experience I had a few years ago. I was working with a team in the science world. They were all PhDs, MDs, nutritionists, very highly educated, very smart people. We were having a team session that I just felt was not going well. After the second day, I went to bed that night. I literally did not sleep all night. And I kept thinking, what's going on here? They're good people. They're smart people. They have a great drive and desire to do this well. They're just not coming together here. I kept working through that sequence in my head most of the night until finally at one point I said, okay, they're good people. They're smart people. They're smart people. That kind of really struck me is that often highly educated, very brilliant, science-oriented people will sort things out and get down to their conclusion, and if it doesn't match someone else's, then we just sort of have this unsolvable conflict on our hands. When we were able to sort of back up and say, let's even look how the brain works. The brain works on our belief systems, sorts out this information, and just gives us what we need to sort of survive and be effective. If you do that, then you have to come to the conclusion that each person in the room may get to a different answer because everything's filtered through their belief systems and their experiences and their desires and where they're trying to go with this thing. And once we can get to that point where it's legitimate in a room full of scientific people that, wow, we may reach different scientific conclusions here, and our job is to sort these out and face the dilemmas and figure out how we're going to move forward with these very different ideas. And that was really a breakthrough for that team. That team still talks to me about that. That experience was probably 15 years ago. A couple of the leaders are still there. Some are in other companies. There'll be times they'll kind of look and go, oh, yeah, we're being too smart, aren't we? And, yeah, okay, let's figure that out. To me, if you can sort of take that science background, that this is really good thinking and legitimate stuff, but given all of that, we may still reach different conclusions and have, different belief systems. As you mentioned, some people call them mental models. I work off that concept a lot. Your description of a belief system I thought was pretty good. Let me throw in one other thing, and then I got to stop talking so much and listen a little bit here. Chris Argyris and Peter Senge and these guys at MIT several years ago got very popular with re-engineering, systems thinking. Senge wrote Fifth Discipline, all very scientific MIT engineering kind of background. When they laid out their triple loop learning, where the first loop is just doing some work and getting some results and putting in your fix, and the second loop of how do we think systemically and look at all of our policies and procedures and processes and principles and make sure all of that's driving the work, that helps. But their third loop was start with beliefs and assumptions, because that drives all the systems thinking. Even though it looks very scientific and rigorous and detail-based, it's still our beliefs and assumptions that drive how things work. And so you got to back up to that third loop and start there. And that's kind of where I start with all my teams. Okay, we have an issue here. Well, let's start with our beliefs and assumptions. I don't know. What are some of your experiences, Josh? You know, you must have had some experiences here where your scientific history affects how you view things and how you look at things and shapes your beliefs and assumptions. How has that come out when you're working with some of these leaders?
The Fifth Discipline is a very big book for me. I read it over 10 years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I'm hearing from you that it's a natural way for scientists to look at, to be able to look at beliefs and say, all right, you have one belief, I have a different belief. We do that. In physics, one day people thought the Earth was at the center of the universe, and then we did some observations. We say that works in some perspectives, but it's a little more helpful to think of the Earth going around the sun and the sun going around the center of the galaxy. So we're like, all right, this belief works one time. It doesn't work in another, so let's switch. And sometimes that's really hard for people. They're like, no, the belief is that's the way things are. You want me to look at it differently? You want me to change the world? I'm like, no, I'm just how you represent it. And it didn't occur to me that, I mean, sometimes it occurs to me, but usually it doesn't occur to me that that's not natural for other people. They get really tied up in their beliefs. To me, that's like I call it being stuck in a mental jail, is you can't get out of that belief. Your experience is that that's a very scientific perspective. That's something that scientists bring in that non-scientists struggle with more.
Right. One of the things that goes along with that is when we start framing up questions or decisions or dilemmas, is that all too often, be it the scientific world or the business world, if you frame up those questions as right versus wrong, you got very little chance of solving it. The only way you can solve it is through power and control and all kinds of issues. But if you begin framing these questions as right versus right, facing a true dilemma, that's the concept of a dilemma. You got two right answers. You just can't go both ways. You got to pick one. But if we come at it that you have a right answer, I have a right answer, person C has a right answer, person D has a right answer, how do we collectively as a leadership team work through this and commit to one direction or another? You know, the ancient concept of dilemma essentially says you're going to get gored either way. You're just picking the horn that's going to gore you. Just that concept helps some of this a lot. But you're right. Some people get it. Some people don't. Some people continue to say, nope, I'm right, you're wrong. You just don't have much of a chance of solving true dilemmas. I personally believe all business decisions essentially are right versus right decisions. They are truly dilemmas.
One of the big challenges when I'm coaching or teaching is people getting stuck on that's wrong. And the way I've always framed it is all assumptions, all beliefs are simplifications of the world, and so they all leave that information. So I say they're all wrong. Yeah. You can take a belief that I suggest and call it wrong. Well, take any belief you have that it would replace. Poke at it enough, you'll find it wrong. You never know when that little detail that you think is not really that important ends up being the most important thing. Yeah. So maybe something that I could do is to bring out a scientific perspective there and say, people used to think the Earth was flat. Yeah. Now we don't. You think you're so right? Well, how right do you think the people who thought the world was flat thought it was? Yeah. And it's funny, I like to ask people, what evidence do you have that the Earth is round? You've seen pictures of the Earth from space, and it looks like a circle. But you weren't there. You didn't take that picture. Like, it doesn't look very round to me. Yeah. I mean, if I just go by what people tell me, well, people tell me lots of things. Yeah. The belief that you can only lead someone if you have authority over them. It's like, that's a belief you have, but, you know, people used to think the Earth was flat. Yep. There's so much that I took for granted that I don't really, you know, if I knew it, everyone knows it. That's not really the case. And also another thing that you mentioned was treating emotions as something that you work with. I look at emotions, the way I've been saying it lately is to say carpenters work with hand tools or tools on wood. Plumbers work with different set of tools on pipe. Leaders work with emotions on people. And so I think of emotions as something, I think of them kind of like Lego. Put them together in ways that work. You can try it one way, try it another way, but eventually you try to get it in ways that work. That perspective also, it replaced emotions being this weird, ethereal bunch of stuff that didn't make any sense to me. You know, reason was rational, so emotions were irrational. It didn't make sense. Is that also something that is a scientific perspective that is not like a normal way that most people think about things? I'm not sure. You're saying, yep. I think because you look at things similarly. Is that right?
You know, you and I are living at a time right now that's just fascinating to me because of the incredible explosion of brain science over the last 15 years probably, you know, because we invented the functional MRI 25 years ago or whenever it was, we're starting to use it to understand how our brain works. And, you know, more and more the people looking at how our brain functions are beginning to realize what salespeople have known for centuries. We buy something based on our emotional side, and then we justify the sale or the purchase based on our rational side. It doesn't make any difference to me whether it's a car or an idea or a concept. I think we approach that the same way. I've run a little experiment with really high-level teams, CEOs, presidents, and their teams for a number of years. And if there's an issue on the table that they're kind of grappling with, at some point, I'll just sort of stop and go around the room and ask each person to tell me how they're thinking about this problem. What do you think this problem is, or what do you think the solution is here? And I'll get very rational answers. A little while later, I'll sort of let that settle in. A little while later, I'll stay right on exactly the same topic, but I'll ask, well, how do you feel about this? Some people in the room will go, well, I just told you what I thought a minute ago. They don't quite grasp the difference in the question. But other people in the room will say, I think our conclusion is rational, and I think we can support it, and it's probably correct, and we could sell it to the board of directors. But do you have any idea how our customers are going to react to that? I mean, they're just going to rebel. We may lose a huge percentage of our customer base based on this decision that I don't think we're ever going to get back. Now, that was an emotional answer to the question of how do you feel about this decision. Almost invariably, it's those questions and those answers that alter the course of the decision-making from what I've seen. We can get very rational, but we're not rational, completely rational human beings. Our salespeople know that General Motors knows that. My wife likes to buy a very mundane, nice little dependable car. So, a few years ago we were in the Chevy dealership buying her one of those kind of things, and the salesman and I are drooling over a Corvette. She looks at us and says, I see no logical reason to buy a Corvette. And our answer was, yeah, what's your point? I mean, General Motors never sold a Corvette on logical reasoning ever, but they make a lot of money on that because they sell it on our salespeople know this. They sell us things based on the emotional side of it. I think we have to sell ideas and concepts and visions and everything based on that as well. And then let's get rational about how are we going to execute it, how are we going to present it, what are we going to do about it. But as human beings, our brain science says more and more that, no, you kind of go to those emotional centers first.
How ironic that coming from a science background, which I think a lot of people associate with not being particularly emotional, and more cold and rational. Maybe it's having a more disinterested perspective on emotions in general allows us to look at emotions in ourselves from a disinterested perspective and be able to hold them up and look at them without the attachment to them, the feeling of them compelling us.
Yep.
And that's not available to a lot of people. It's funny because to me, I took acting lessons, and that got me much more in touch with being able to sense other people's emotions, being able to express my emotions more and act on my emotions more clearly.
Yeah.
Actors, I think that's one of the things they do. Yeah. But they get caught up in them. I mean, they are able to separate them, but maybe the scientific perspective says, look at emotions as emotions, not as hold separate that you're feeling something.
Right. Yeah. And take it as a very legitimate thing to look at and a very legitimate piece of information that you bring to the decision-making process because it's valid. It's there.
So this resonates with a lot of what people say. It's like they keep saying that I look at stuff in a different way, and I'm able to look at stuff that they can't. And I've been like, I've never gotten them to explain in a way that really, I couldn't see how what I was saying was not ordinary. I mean, I could tell that it works because I can see the results, and so I do what works, and I've refined that and practiced that. But not having been somebody else, I haven't seen what I haven't seen. I think there's also, in what you're saying, a simplicity that I've always associated with. This I think I get. As a physicist, we're always looking to simplify things and to create and find a model underneath. Now, it's something may be very complex, but we can work. It's difficult to work with complexity, so we find the simplicity within it. That usually we try to find a model and with some predictive power that later engineers will take and make something with, and we want to understand it at a level. And that simplicity, that drive and experience in finding simplicity within complexity and refining it out in a way that is usable, that I think is something that I bring to the table. And that one of the reasons I left physics was that it was getting increasingly difficult to explain what I did to other people, and I got it, but they didn't really engage with it. Yeah. And one of the things I really like about leadership is it's quintessentially engaging, especially because the clients that come to me are coming because they want to engage people more. And how does simplicity figure in for you?
One of the beliefs, one of the mental models that I use, I go back to Aristotle and his 4 levels of happiness. I believe his level 3 gets into very clear leadership development, but his level 4, which he would have said and did say that that's sort of the highest level of human happiness. The words that he used around that were truth, love, purpose, beauty, and unity. To me, the truth part is exactly what we're talking about here. How do we get at the truth from every angle? And his love part had nothing to do with the emotional aspects of what we think love. I think the Greeks had at least 3 different words that get translated into our word love. His probably would be translated more respect for the other person's thought and understanding, that ability to listen, to understand it. So get at the truth with respect. The beauty word is probably what we would call elegance or simplicity. It's getting the complexity out, as you were just saying. The only way we're going to lead these organizations is make things simple and elegant and get rid of the friction and all those kind of things. And then unity is coming to a commitment. If we came in with all of these different beliefs on our truths at the one end of that spectrum, coming out the other spectrum is, if we don't build some unity and commitment in this, we're not going to be successful here. That I think I go right back to that model that, we actually need all of these. We need to get at the truth and understand that we have multiple truths. And we got to work through these with respect and simplify it, but we got to reach a level of commitment at the other end of this thing. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. You've seen them, I've seen them. You get to some of the top levels of these organizations, and a lot of key leaders will very respectfully and politely say, we just choose to disagree. My reaction is, you can't. As soon as you disagree and don't reach commitment at the top level of the organization, that fissure expands down through the organization. You create all kinds of havoc in the organization if you don't develop unity, a commitment to a particular direction at the top, even though you start with very different belief systems.
There's a couple things I want to follow up here. I want to go back to something you said before about talking to people about how they feel and decisions being something that comes after the recognition of a decision comes afterward. But it makes me think of a lot of people when I ask them how they feel, even your answer that you said was an emotional answer, didn't actually tell you how they felt. Okay. I have this one client, and I asked her, how does something make you feel? And she'll say, well, I did this and I did that. And I was like, okay, that's your behavior. That's what you did, but how did you feel? And she's like, well, I wanted blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, that's what you wanted, but sometimes I think people aren't really in touch with them. Sometimes I think people put big protections around them because they're afraid of them.
Yep, I agree. You get that full spectrum. Mm-hmm.
Have you found ways of making it more apparent for people? For me, the big thing is just experience. And 2, is there something that, as a scientist, that I can promote as saying this is something that can help you, or this is why working with me helps you become aware of these things or adept with these things?
Well, I think you do run into it all over the board, Josh. Some people, as you say, just sort of need that awareness. They've never developed that awareness. And sometimes it's just that. Well, let's talk about it. Let's ask. Okay, you're telling me what you would do, but you're not telling me how you feel. And sometimes you have to ask the questions, several times and work down into that. And with some people, it'll eventually kind of dawn on them that there is some of that here. Or if I can talk to them about away from work or their child or some other things. There are some people, however, that through any sort of, emotional history and emotional scars just have developed some scar tissue that sometimes they're just not willing to open up. I do a lot of one-on-one work, and I think you do as well. I've had people tell me things in those sessions that they've never told anybody before, some very horrific stuff. I've been concerned at times and I've shared with them if I think they need to get professional help that I can't provide, or if even there's some criminal element related to it. There are some people that scar tissue is pretty thick, and you may or may not get to that. Will they still function? Will they still be a part of it? Sure, they can be, but sometimes it gets in the way as well. I don't think there's any clean answer about that one. I think there's things that you can do to build on that. It just triggered another thought for me. I guess I'll just bring it up and see if maybe you're aware of this. So one of the things I became aware of a long time ago, and I've asked this question of clients, is if you have just done something, behaved in a way or made a decision or that you regret, when you feel that pain of regret, where does it manifest itself? Now, not 100% of people can answer that question, but the majority of people will tell me where they feel it. For me, it's right in my sternum. Other people will say it's in my jaw, it's in my shoulder, it's in my neck, it's in my forehead, it's in my upper arms, it's in my lower arm. I mean, it's all over the place. It's an individual kind of thing, but you actually feel a manifestation of it. You feel the physical pain when you do something or say something or make a decision or react a certain way that's going to create regret. Once you identify that spot, for years, it was just based on my experience. But again, I'm now reading some brain science that verifies this, is that it's actually an early warning system. You actually feel the pain of that regret before you execute the behavior. I kind of hate to admit this, I guess, but I've become so aware of that myself that I have this little argument in my brain. I feel that sensation for me in my sternum, and I go, oh, there it is. Okay, Ron, you're about to say something you're going to regret later. And the other half of my brain says, I know, but it needs to be said anyway. And the other, back to the other side, are you sure? Because you're going to regret this. Yeah, I know, but I think, and I have this little amazing split-second conversation where I actually decide whether to do something that I'm going to regret later or not. Now, it doesn't prevent me from doing it 100% of the time. Sometimes I choose to go ahead and do it, and indeed, it never fails. I do regret it, but at least it was a conscious decision, or at least I think it was. I don't know. Maybe I'm fooling myself with my brain there, but it's amazing that you can become aware of a pain that's going to cause you regret early enough to actually make some decision whether you do it or not. As you say, some people aren't aware of their emotions. Some people are really tuned into them. But a lot of my clients have picked up on that. Several of them, as soon as I ask them to point to where that pain manifests themselves, just that moment, boy, you can see the light bulb go off, and they go, oh, you know what? I am aware that happens. I just never paid attention to it before until after it was too late.
You're speaking with a sensitivity to emotional things that I think a lot of people don't have that sensitivity. I used to associate sensitivity with more like artists. It didn't seem like a scientific thing. And one time not long ago, I was talking to someone about increasing your sensitivity to certain things. And I realized actually in engineering and science, it's a big thing. Like we're always observing things and we want to make detectors that are more sensitive to things. Yeah. And I wonder if that's another thing that, as I was saying, I don't remember who I was talking to, but I remember thinking, sensitivity is something that is a big scientific concept that we always want to improve our sensitivity, our detector sensitivity, and maybe that's also something that we develop. Again, when I was a kid growing up, you were either macho as a man, as a boy, you're either macho or you're a sensitive New Age guy. And the idea of being sensitive as being just a practical tool, not as being like some sensitive New Age guy.
Yeah.
I guess that's something also that maybe a scientific perspective brings in, to be sensitive without being, not my language, but like a pansy.
Yeah, right. Yeah. If I go back to my Aristotle model, you and I talked about the books we've written the other day. My book, Trust Me, about leadership, his model starts with humility, and it's the key ingredient. It's one of the things that Jim Collins, in his book Good to Great, tried to repress for a while. His research paper, and I was so glad that he actually put in his book saying, no, I don't want to hear this stuff about some leadership style. And his researchers kept saying, we got to talk about it. There's a leadership style that is in place with every company that went from good to great. And it started with humility. They're incredibly driven, smart, intelligent, educated people, but they have this humility about them that says, look, I know what I know, but help me understand what you know, because that's going to make me better. Just like you were talking about that macho man and our concept of the pansy or whatever, the word humility has lost its original meaning. If you go back to its original source, it was tightly coupled with the word meek. And, we had the old adage of the meek shall inherit the earth, and that didn't make any sense to me either, until you understand the root of those words meant tremendous power under complete control. So you've got the power and authority to dictate anything you want to dictate, but if you keep that under control and exhibit a humble attitude, you learn more, others learn more, we get tuned into these things. Maybe it is an emotional thing, maybe it isn't, but you're much more open to that. To me, the number one element in leadership is a sense of humility about, no, I know a lot, and I'm very confident with that. It's funny, the other thing I've discovered through the years is that there is a correlation between humility and self-esteem. Truly humble people seem to have great self-esteem. It seems counterintuitive, but it's not. They just are very comfortable with who they are and what they believe, but very open to your beliefs as well.
So are there other, I covered up like the ability to look at beliefs as with distance and to look at emotions with distance or dispassion. Still feeling the passion, but not it running you. Simplicity, sensitivity. Anything else come to mind that I didn't pick up on that's worth looking at? Maybe
the only other thing is just relationships is so powerful. We see more and more research on that. I'll mention a book here that's probably well before your time. We'll see if you read it or not, or knew of it. But it was the book called Future Shock.
I remember seeing it on my parents' shelf, but I don't. Toffler.
Well, Alvin Toffler, wrote
and he
that
died
book.
Recently. I remember the president at the time, I think, was like big into him.
Yeah. One sentence in that book that stuck with me through the years, and it's probably two sentences, I guess, but it's 4 words. His 4 words were high tech, high touch. And the premise of the book was this coming technological revolution is going to shock our human system. But if you expect it to work, then you bet high touch has to increase with the high tech. This really comes into play with our global teams that see each other only, via Skype or WebEx or email or, whatever technology they're using, and never are in a room together and actually shake someone's hand and get to know them and understand who they are as human beings. Without that, the high tech doesn't serve us very well and actually creates difficulties. If you increase the high touch along with the high tech, it becomes a pretty formidable solution. But in today's world of go fast, never see each other, our sort of gig economy where, I'll do this job, I'll do that job, I'll do this job, I'll do it remotely, bam, 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 bam. I have a great fear that we're losing touch with each other, which is half the equation. I mean, you take either side of that equation to zero, and the result times zero is zero. I mean, it just doesn't work. So.
And I guess the scientific approach, I also look at, I look at relationships as something like I teach techniques to learn the skills as opposed to suggesting that you have to have it or born with it or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I appreciate this. Like a lot of stuff is coming together that it's even already starting to seem a bit obvious in retrospect. I guess I was shutting out maybe out of some kind of humility on my part. I don't think of myself as a particularly humble person, but of thinking that, I think a lot of stuff that I worked at, that I used science to get to, I figured I'm using science, I'm getting something that everyone already has, emotional skills and emotional awareness and things like that. I thought I was catching up with everybody, but maybe it's stuff that no one has, or you're lucky if life happened to give you the experiences to get these things.
Maybe, yep. Maybe
if you come from a background and you learn like French literature, it didn't quite give you the access that this particular perspective does. And I'm not saying it's good for everyone, but I guess my clients keep going back. So I guess it works for some people.
Yep.
Do you ever wonder if, I did have one person who said to me, if you start understanding this stuff too much, sometimes you lose the excitement. You kind of like in a long relationship after you've known each other well enough, the passion dissipates. And I love leadership and I love what I do.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see that, I can see what it's talking about. Is that something that is an issue for you? Have you seen something like that in yourself or in your clients? Is it possible that people could understand it too much from a disinterested perspective, that they lose their passion?
All I can do is answer that from my own experience. I kind of gave you some of my early history. So I was 40 years old when I sort of started down this leadership development path, trying to figure it out what I do. I'm now 70 years old, and people will say, well, when are you going to retire? And my reaction is, why would I retire? This is so much fun. This is so fascinating. I'm learning so much. It would take too much to explain the history of it, but essentially I've had 3 books in my head. I've written the first one on leadership, but the second one I wanted to write on teams, on building great teams. And it's been 13, 14 years since I wrote the first one. And I was getting quite disgusted with myself of, you're just procrastinating, you're putting it off, you're just not disciplined enough. I came to the conclusion about a year ago that, you know what, I wasn't ready. I hadn't learned enough about true team building and how teams really work until I've had the last 14, 15 years of experience with teams. And it's not the end all, obviously, but I'm now ready. Just in the last 6 weeks, I've probably written a third of the book. No, I haven't. I want to keep learning this stuff as long as I can. I mean, what will halt me is just, at some point, my physical inability to go do this. But I'm trying to cultivate other ways. Can I build up my blog readership? Can I write more books? Can I, do the things I'm doing with you right now today? How do we learn from each other? This is fun stuff, man. I mean, I can't imagine going through my days without this. So personal experience is, I've learned a lot. Got a lot more to learn, and man, it's fun learning.
That reminds me of I once saw a panel discussion with the actor Brian Dennehy was on stage in the panel. They were talking about how he had played Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman for some record number of performances. It went to Q&A, and someone from the audience said, do you ever get bored of doing the same thing over and over again? And he said, on the contrary, I feel like I'm just getting to understand the character now.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
And that changed a lot for me about acting. I didn't realize it's not you're doing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at it that way, but it's you genuinely are in the thing that you are being someone. Acting is you are being a person.
Yeah.
And maybe I have to bring that to what I'm doing here. Or I do already, but I've been doing it in a different way. I want to come at one last question to wrap things up.
Okay.
Here are some benefits of a scientific background, perspective, set of skills, set of beliefs to leadership training. How does one promote this? How do you communicate this to people who don't know us yet? How do you say, being a rocket scientist, a lot of people say, okay, that means you're smart, you can solve abstract problems. Does that necessarily mean that you can solve leadership issues? Does that necessarily mean you'll help me become a better person or leader? How do you communicate that?
All right. I'm going to answer it very specifically first, and then maybe we'll back up for a general. So rocket science, in the very early days of rocketry, Wernher von Braun and Goddard and all of those guys who were building the first rockets quickly discovered that they could build a rocket with enough thrust. Thrust was not the issue. What they couldn't do was hit a target. They actually had to they thought they were going to be complete once they built the rocket with enough thrust. They accomplished that, but they couldn't hit a target. So they had to back up, recruit more brain power, more understanding, create a lot more learning to figure out what they coined the term feedback mechanisms so that they could hit a target. When I sat in a room full of executive leadership in very smart industries like pharmaceutical and high tech and automotive and food and all the other industries I deal in, one of my first reactions and one of the things I share with those teams is thrust is not the problem. There's enough drive, intelligence, education, willpower. It's all here. The problem is you got to figure out how to hit a target together. And the only way you're going to do that is develop good feedback mechanisms. We have to learn how to give each other very solid, very straightforward feedback so that collectively we can actually hit a target. Thrust is not the problem, and it never is at that high level of an organization. So it is rocket science, I guess, if you want to start with that. I don't know. There's just lessons upon lessons, science world. Now, we're talking about the science world, but we got to be a little careful with that. Liberal arts, your artists, your educators, I almost don't care what your background in industry is. There's stuff to be learned about leadership and what those backgrounds bring to it. Maybe you and I have that scientific engineering background, and I work in industries that have a lot of that. But one of my clients ran an IT firm for a Fortune 200 company. At one point, he stopped hiring IT people from colleges and started hiring liberal arts students. They were a little confused, like, wait a minute, you're asking me to come into the high-tech world? He said, I can teach you the high-tech. What I have trouble teaching the high-tech people is all the personal connections and understanding and humanness of the issue, and that's what we need.
I hear that all the time with my clients, is like I teach them how to relate to people, and they start getting promoted and getting jobs, and they constantly get told, I can teach you X, but I can't teach you how to get it. And the thing is, what's getting them promoted is what I teach them. Like, I'm teaching them how to get it.
Yeah.
Which is part of what drives me to want to teach my stuff. I love one-on-one because I can see the results very quickly and I can form that personal relationship, but I really want to get it out to the whole world because the whole world is missing. The whole world thinks you can't teach getting it, and yet what gets them hired the most to, like, top positions. I mean, if you want to get an entry-level position, just send your resume. But people don't want entry-level positions that have high turnover because they have high turnover because people don't like them.
Yep.
And they like getting hired by the CEO to do strategic stuff and, what they really love based on the CEO knowing that you love that thing.
Yeah.
I want to wrap up, not because I think we could keep going for a long time, and I'm really enjoying this, but I think people, if you make it too long, people stop listening anyway. But I want to ask you, is there anything I didn't think to bring up that came up at your end or that didn't come up that you think is worth bringing up?
I think your approach here, Josh, to this is a pretty good one. As I'm getting into your book, and that reveals a little bit how you're thinking. Yeah, we hear this stuff, we know this stuff, but what are just some good practical ways to get better at these things, which is kind of what I liked about your book. You were talking, I think, in the sort of becoming self-aware of you called it, I think, the personal essay exercise about sort of writing all that stuff down and sharing it with people.
Yeah, the first one, kind of breaking the ice.
Yeah, the first consultant I ever met, I was actually back in the engineering world, was working with me, and he had me do that exercise. He said, I want you to write down where you want to be and what do you want to be doing, who do you want to be talking to, what kind of information do you want to share with them? What do you want them to get from you? What do you want to get from them? He just kind of hounded me until I had written several pages of that. He gave me some outline and then encouraged others. And as I got through that, he said, okay, send that to your boss and your boss's boss. Well, man, I was a 26-year-old engineer. I said, are you kidding me? I'm not going to say. No, I insist. You absolutely have to do it. And that experience actually changed my whole direction with that company. Within less than a year, I was doing things that I was a lot more excited about, a lot more energized about, a lot better at doing. Did I still have a lot to learn? You bet. But it just really struck me when I was reading through your book that, you know what, I had the good fortune of experiencing exactly that 40 years ago. So I guess one of my thoughts is encouragement as to how you're thinking about this stuff and what you're doing. I think one of the things we experience is the stuff that seems natural to us, we assume doesn't have that much value sometimes. And yet it does. I mean, don't get caught in that trap. I really like where you're going with this thing, and just keep building on it. Your model of your self-awareness and self-leadership and other awareness and other leaderships is a great model. It's going to impact a lot of people. I was very encouraged by it.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I hope that people listening, you saying it adds credibility, because if I say, you said things exactly how I'd want to say it, but if I say, of course I'm promoting my own stuff.
Yeah. Yep.
So I appreciate that. Thank you. And maybe we'll follow with another one time, but we'll close off now, and then I'll just stop the recording, and then we'll wrap up a little bit afterwards. So let me just see if I can do this right.
All right. Sounds good.